Chinese Premier Li Keqiang emphasized that China wants to be a staunch contributor to regional and global peace and development. So what defines China's policy in this, and how can it help fulfill the UN Sustainable Development Goals? And a company from China has finished the construction of the third largest mosque in the world, also the tallest building in Africa. What barriers did they have to overcome in its construction? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. In its annual press conference, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang emphasized that China wants to be a staunch safeguard and contributor to regional and global peace and development. As China sticks to its multilateral approach to global governance and the Belt and Road Initiative, how can China contribute to the global efforts to achieve the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals? How should one understand China's approach to global leadership and development? Joining me here in the studio is Dean Scott Appleby of the Keele School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, US. Dean Appleby, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Premier Li Keqiang last year met with Mr. Achim Steiner, who is the attributor of the United Nations Development Program. And during the meeting, Premier Li said China remains and will remain for a long time a developing country featuring inadequate and unbalanced development. He also added that the country is willing to align its development planning with the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, meaning the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. How do you see the characteristics of China's Sustainable Development Plan?
First, let us be clear that the Sustainable Development Goals are breathtaking in their ambition. I think we can use that word. Eradicate poverty, provide clean drinking water for everyone, peaceful and stable societies. I mean, they're very idealistic, and they're comprehensive. They're 17, but of course they're detailed in so many ways that one shudders almost to think, how can they be accomplished? So we start there.
Yeah.
China, though, it's good to hear China's leadership talking about working with the United Nations and within this framework, because if these goals are going to be established and achieved in any meaningful way, one would expect that China would have to play an important role.
We are 1/5 of humanity.
Indeed. And now, does that mean that China should meet every one of these 17 goals or their subsets? I don't think that can be asked of any nation. But China's leadership has spoken frequently recently about markers of sustainable development in the Chinese economy that seem to make perfect sense and be perfectly compatible in contributing to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there has been an emphasis on eliminating poverty, rural poverty in particular, in China. And I know there's criticism that some say, what about the urban poor who have moved to the cities? But nonetheless, the government has focused on eliminating poverty. There is, as we all know, been a real emphasis on sustainability and on environmental stewardship. If China doesn't take the lead in this area, along with the United States and others, they won't be achieved.
There are people who are saying, however, that it seems that China has put particular emphasis on certain aspects of these development goals, such as what you mentioned, poverty and energy or environment, but there are also 15 others at least. And there are people who are saying that they have to be interconnected, that you can't really just work on some of these goals and ignore the other, because otherwise it wouldn't be meaningful.
That's right. The key to these Sustainable Development Goals is the recognition that the challenges facing the world are all interconnected. So global warming is going to lead and has led to wars over resources, land and water, healthcare crises, flows of refugees. None of these problems can begin to be solved if there is not effective governance, and so corruption is a major problem. This has also been an emphasis in China, eliminating or reducing corruption. An argument is being put forth, it seems, by the leadership, which suggests this. Yes, we're not going to cover all 17 of these goals in 17 great programs, but if through this incredible Belt and Road Initiative, really links multilateral, endorses a multilateral approach that builds peace among societies through trade and economics, if that can be taken seriously, if there's leadership on environment, these core elements will help the rest of the world to move forward on many of the goals.
There are priorities, I sense, that China is putting on some aspects, especially when it comes to developmental issues such as poverty. I don't think there is a big problem with hunger, but poverty, health, ecological system, and so on and so forth. So how do you look at the balance between the interconnectivity of all of these sustainable development goals and priorities that countries have to set given their different circumstances?
Good. To stick with China for a moment, I think some of the goals are challenging for China and will be obstacles. And I think if they take the challenges seriously, that will be important. Some of the goals are around questions that we might call social justice, questions of equality, question of attention for women and children. There are goals that are related to human rights. Well, how does China contribute to that conversation on so many of these goals that are not, in a way, the more obvious central goals we've mentioned, poverty reduction?
I'm sorry, I sense a slight difference in understanding here, because it seems that your understanding of these goals are separate from the socio and economic development goals, for instance, poverty. You think that the gender equality or social justice seem to belong to the greater category of human rights that is not being put on the same high level of priority?
Well, the question would be, for any nation, but to stick for a moment with China, in emphases in approaches to education, for example, is there not only in these approaches an attempt to bring the education of women into alignment with privileges that men have had for generations, but also an attempt to be compensatory, to say our policies really are going to target women in the best sense of that term. We're really going to have a proactive way, a proactive set of policies that focus on the education of women, because the perception is in these goals that women have been overlooked, and that not only in a negative way, one would say, women around the world, certainly not just in China, across the world, have been subordinate, secondary, often victims of violence, discrimination of various kinds. We know this. It's a patriarchal world. And so what does it mean? So in a negative sense, justice would call for ending that, eliminating it, reducing it. But in a more positive sense, if you leave half of the world and its creativity and its potential untapped, you'll never reach these goals. So just to take that issue, gender equality, one would almost say women having an advantage, a preferential option for women in following the goals and trying to implement the goals, because that also lifts all boats, to have women empowered across the board at every sector of society. That's going to be a challenge for many societies, not only for China or the U.S.
Well, I think the Chinese approach, my understanding, and I absolutely agree with what you say about the potential of women having to be, that need to be tapped into. I think I benefited, my generation and even my parents' my mother's generation benefited greatly from this kind of sense of equality that has that was allowed to flourish and to take root in the Chinese society. But at the same time, I think equally important is the approach to lift the overall socio and economic development level of the society, so that all of these equality issues, either gender or ethnic minority or majority, can go up together. As you said, the boat can go up together. So that is one of the issues that I think is on top of the mind of the Chinese government. My understanding, the kind of differences that reflected in our discussion just now also is seen on a larger scale. What is China's role? What is China's role in the world? Some people are saying China needs to have a moral leadership instead of a rogue leadership. China needs to follow rules, the rule of law. And my question would be, what is considered to be a moral leadership? What does that mean? Is there a certain set of definition or criteria?
That's a great question. First, we would acknowledge about China that China is still a developing country, and everyone acknowledges that. And so to expect China to make such rapid progress that it's made in development, broadly understood over the last 20 or more years, and then to step into moral leadership is to ask a great deal. But when we begin to look at specifics of what we might call moral leadership, China seems to be, in some of its policies, a great supporter of certain UN rules and regulations. And around trade, around international relations, international cooperation, this almost seems ironic or unexpected from, say, an American point of view, that China would, in certain ways, be an upholder of the liberal United Nations in some fronts, liberal in the sense of openness, greater openness.
Well, China is one of the founding members of the United Nations. China
Yes.
signed up to the UN Charter. China is signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are different understanding to this issue. What China has said is, by the way, the number of non-governmental organizations in China have also been growing rapidly since according to the latest human rights white paper released by the Chinese government. What China says is, look, the UN Charter enshrines the sovereignty of countries, equality of countries, and the non-interference of each other's internal affairs.
Yes.
So these are the fundamental principles of international relations. So if there are human rights dialogue, fine, China is actively participating. But if there are human rights, if there are interference, what is seen as interference in China's internal affairs under the pretext of human rights, that would
It's a good point.
not be accepted. Yeah.
The counter-argument was articulated by Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, who said, we made a mistake in talking about non-intervention or sovereignty in absolute terms. That might have made sense 30 or 40 years ago. In a world today that is so interdependent, just take the environment alone. To say state sovereignty trumps every other consideration. I know at the other end you could have a real problem if you say, well, there is no state sovereignty. But to take refuge in a kind of absolute state sovereignty in a world that's so independent economically, environmentally, militarily, security-wise, that's also a road I think that China itself doesn't want to go down.
I understand. I think it's a very interesting point, because there was a recent movie called The Wandering Earth, and there was an international government, a united government. But you know, whether that's going to happen anytime soon, nobody knows. And from what we're seeing, it seems that the United Nations role has been put into doubts, especially by one of the key founders. I think although there are areas where sovereignty should step slightly aside in terms of, for instance, when there is a UN-endorsed intervention, that then there is no sovereignty to speak of.
Oh, I think.
But at this moment, when these are the rules that everybody has discussed, when countries are still operating very much along these lines, how should we keep a balance?
So back to your question about moral leadership on the part of China, let's take the environmental issue. I think we could hopefully agree that preserving the planet and a habitat that we can all live in is a moral question. It's a question of right and wrong. And that means subordinating other priorities to this one. China is in a position to take moral leadership in that sense of moral leadership, precisely because of its a recognition that it makes no sense to have enormous economic growth if we can't breathe the air. And the fact that the state seems to is committed, from what I've been reading, to addressing this problem systematically within China alone. To do that successfully, to make that a real priority, to accept the trade-offs that come with that in other parts of the economy, that's a narrow but a very real sense of moral leadership.
I hope that is going to be the case, that it's going to continue to be the case. You know from the air that you have been breathing in the past few days. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Dean Appleby from the University of Notre Dame.